Over the years, Final Fantasy has introduced a huge volume of gameplay and world-building elements. But whereas some remain isolated to the installments where they were first introduced, others, such as Chocobos or the inclusion of a character called Cid, go on to become mainstays, featuring in the vast majority of mainline iterations as well as the various spin-offs that have been produced over the years. And in that regard, one of the most cemented elements has to be the inclusion of airships. Introduced within the first ever Final Fantasy, airships went on to become pivotal components for how the player would navigate throughout the world, and as the years progressed, they also became intertwined with each iteration of Cid. But what's interesting is just how much the concept of airships has evolved over the years, and it's why we're excited to take you through this topic in our typical granular style. So, sit back and relax as we explore the complete evolution of airships. The first airship was seen during the second half of the original Final Fantasy. By this point in the quest, the Warriors of Light had already gained access to numerous modes of transport, such as the ship and the canoe. Each had clear limitations, and after acquiring the airship, which acted as the third and final mode of transport, many of those limitations would disappear. To find the airship, players would need to acquire the Levis Stone and use it within the Ryukan Desert. And once it had been raised, players would gain access to a fast and efficient mode of transport. The only real limitation was that the airship could only land on grassy plains. The other major point of note related to the design of the airship, as it was very literal. And this perhaps explains the Japanese word, which to our rudimentary understanding of Japanese, combines numerous kanji to essentially create the word flying boat. This would see the airship be designed with a wooden hull that, if placed in water, would conceivably allow the airship to function as a boat. The main difference was that instead of sails being attached to the mast, there were numerous propellers. Final Fantasy II had more emphasis on airships in general, with the Dreadnought being of particular focus. But in terms of airships that had a more direct relationship with the party, there were some interesting changes. In the initial sense, access to the airship was granted by Cid, a former engineer who retired to pursue his passion for airborne transportation. To help him pay for this hobby, he established a trading company, whereby the airship he created was used to transport goods and people, and this was how initial access was granted to the player via a ferry service. When airborne, players would see that the design of the airship was almost identical to the one seen within the original Final Fantasy, no doubt to save time in development. That meant it had a wooden hull and propellers on the mast, but in the concept art, we could see the airship was envisioned to be much grander, doubling down on the notion of it being an airborne boat, as there were portholes and even an anchor. After Cid perished at the hands of the Empire, he then bequeathed his airship to the party, and this granted access to a mode of transport that had identical function to what was seen within the previous game. Final Fantasy III, on the surface at least, appeared to continue in the same vein. Perhaps as a throwback to the original Final Fantasy, it would see the party find an airship within the desert west of Kazis. This airship belonged to Cid, who lent it to the party, and it was affectionately named Cid's Airship, something that represented the first time a player-controlled airship was given a formal name, as the two previous iterations were unnamed in the official sense. This airship had a similar in-game pixel art to the two previous airships, but there were some unique distinctions. For one, unlike its forebears, it could not travel over mountains. This airship was also upgraded by Taka with the mithril ram so that it could be used to remove an obstacle, but even though the ramming process was successful, Cid's airship was destroyed. To compensate, Final Fantasy III upped the ante compared to the two previous games by featuring not one, but 4 airships. And the second, called the Enterprise, could be obtained by the party not too long after the destruction of Cid's airship. Unlike the previous 3 airships seen within the franchise, the Enterprise was neither granted to the party through its association with Cid, nor was it found. Instead, it was granted to the party as a reward after the Vikings were pleased with how the party appeased Nepto. This airship was also quite unique in that it was much more aligned with the airship name, as it could only land on water as opposed to grassy plains. However, like Cid's airship, it would also be rendered unusable. The third airship, dubbed the Nautilus, was given to the party by the Ceronians, and it also had a unique quality. Due to its shape, which in its pixel art was much more like a submarine than a boat, it could fly against intense winds without being penalized. Initially, the Nautilus could only land in grassy areas, but playing into the submarine design, it could also be upgraded to not only land on water, but also dive underwater, granting access to several previously inaccessible dungeons. The fourth and final airship was then dubbed the Invincible, and it furthered the trend of having a unique function. After being found in the ancient ruins, players would notice that it was neither as fast as the Nautilus, nor could it go underwater. However, it could reach high altitudes, meaning that unlike the three other airships, it could fly over mountains. Due to how remote some of the locations were that were now accessible due to the ability to fly over mountains, the developers also turned the Invincible into a mobile town. This meant it was possible for the party to go inside the airship, where they would find beds for restoring their HP and MP, as well as shops for buying magic, weapons, armor, and items. And if that wasn't enough, the Invincible was also equipped with a cannon that could deal damage during random encounters. The connection between Sid and airships continued within Final Fantasy IV. Not only was he the mastermind behind the Red Wings' mobile fleet, having become suspicious of the King of Baron, he also designed another airship in secret called the Enterprise. This would then be given to the party by Sid so that they could take the fight to Golbez. Its design was reminiscent of the default airship seen within the previous 3 games, and so too was its functionality. This meant it could only land on grassy plains, but it was able to fly over mountains. As part of the story, the Enterprise would be damaged and subsequently repaired and upgraded. This would see it able to withstand the heat of the underworld, but it was also fitted with a crane attachment that allowed the Enterprise to pick up the hovercraft and ferry it around the world. While the Enterprise was being upgraded, the party would commandeer another airship called the Falcon. This too would be upgraded, allowing it to withstand heat, and with a drill fitted to the front, it would be crucial in allowing the party to return to the surface. In keeping with the new trend, Final Fantasy IV also featured a third airship, the Lunar Whale, but this particular airship was unlike anything seen before within the franchise. Every previous airship design had been based around the concept of a flying boat, and to deliver this, each airship had a wooden hull with propellers. The Lunar Whale continued the concept of a flying, seafaring object, with it of course resembling a whale, but it was not made of wood, and there were no propellers. And this was because the Lunar Whale was more akin to a spaceship, featuring a metal hull and an advanced propulsion system that made it capable of interplanetary travel. Despite these huge differences, the Lunar Whale did have one thing in common with previous airships, however, specifically the Invincible from Final Fantasy III, as the party could walk around its interior with them able to use healing pods to replenish their HP and MP. With there being such a huge focus on airships in Final Fantasy III and IV, both in terms of their narrative involvement and the sheer volume of them, there must have been an expectation going into Final Fantasy V that this trend would continue. And in many regards, that did remain true. However, despite there being a huge number of traits present, they were all focused on a single airship that, much like in Final Fantasy I and II, would be nameless. The airship would be discovered by Sid and his grandson Mid, deep within some ancient ruins known as the Catapult, and the pair would grant access to the party so that they could continue their quest. But although its design would be reminiscent of early, more basic airships, by the end of the game, through various upgrades, it could not only land on grassy plains and fly over mountains, but could also land on water and act as a regular ship, submerge and act as a submarine, and fly to higher altitudes. It meant the only major trait it did not fulfill was providing the party a place to replenish their HP and MP on the go. But despite this, through the efforts of Sid and Mid, this particular airship was a technological marvel. By the time Final Fantasy VI arrived, the franchise was starting to mature. This meant the narrative was more expansive and wider gameplay elements were less formulaic. But even though big changes were starting to be made in other areas, airships still played an important role in opening up the world map and giving players the freedom to explore. Within this particular game, there were 2 airships available to the player that helped towards this objective. The first, called the Blackjack, was owned by Setzer Gabbiani, something that broke the association we'd seen between airships and a character called Sid over the past 4 games. That's not to say that Sid wasn't involved though, as he would later help Setzer repair the airship after it crashed. The Blackjack would first be made accessible to the party after Celes deceived Setzer, and it provided them with a lot of utility that pulled from each of the major airships from the past. This meant the Blackjack could fly over mountains and land on grassy plains, but it also provided numerous services such as an item shop, a healer, and even a casino. The other airship accessible to the party was the Falcon, but unlike previous games, it provided no enhancements and actually had less utility than the Blackjack, as the item shop, healer and casino were not available. Aside from that, both the Blackjack and the Falcon had an intriguing design deviation from previous games, as they were no longer airships in their traditional sense. The designers instead based their designs on blimps, which within our reality are closer to what we would call airships, with each airship in the game even including a gondola. Final Fantasy VII would then include a pretty iconic airship that both evolved what was seen within Final Fantasy VI and pulled from many other sources from the past. The Highwind was built by Cid Highwind, returning that association, and after it was commandeered by Cid, it became the final mode of transport available to the player. In the initial sense, it could fly over mountains and land on grassy plains. Its design was also reminiscent of the Falcon from Final Fantasy VI, as it had a metallic hull with a gondola below the main body of the ship. Players could also venture inside the Highwind, where they could meet the crew and even save their game. As the story progressed, the Highwind would be upgraded to increase its speed, removing the propellers and replacing them with rockets, something that had never been seen before in a prior airship. And after receiving too much damage, the Highwind was also able to do something no prior airship had accomplished, as by altering its form, it avoided destruction or a crippling crash. Outside of this, the Highwind also had a role in battle, as it formed part of Cid Highwind's limit break, a particular trait not seen since Final Fantasy III, and there was also a nice throwback to Final Fantasy IV, as it could be used to carry another mode of transport. However, unlike in Final Fantasy IV, where the airship could pick up the hovercraft, in this instance, the Highwind could be used to transport chocobos. Just as many games had done before, Final Fantasy VIII would feature numerous modes of transport, and perhaps one of the most unique was Balam Garden, which fulfilled a similar role to a hovercraft. But when focusing primarily on airships, even though there was only one available to the player, we got to see some pretty solid evolutions. The Ragnarok was founded by Squall and Renoa during their escapades in space, and after they cleared its internal areas of propagators, they gained access to a mode of transport that was the first spaceship since the Lunar Whale in Final Fantasy IV. As such, the Ragnarok did not have the traditional airship design, nor did it resemble a blimp. Instead, it was much more futuristic, even able to transform to look like a living creature. In terms of function, the Ragnarok was quite similar to previous airships, able to land on grassy plains and fly over mountains, but it could also land directly on certain locations such as Fisherman's Horizon. The internal areas were also accessible, granting access to a shop as well as members of the card club, assuming that side quest had been completed. Perhaps the biggest innovation, however, was autopilot. This would allow players to select a destination on the world map, which the Ragnarok would then fly to automatically. With Final Fantasy IX acting as a nostalgic tribute to many of the 8-bit and 16-bit era games, it made sense that airships would be prevalent throughout the world, and they would have a strong connection with a character called Cid. But even though that were the case, and the player would interact with numerous airships throughout their adventure, they would only be granted access to 2. The first, the Hildegard 3, served as a throwback to the more traditional airship. Not only was it the third iteration, having been upgraded numerous times, it featured a design that resembled a boat, albeit with plenty of flair, and it relied on propellers for its propulsion. The Hildegard 3 would also be able to traverse anywhere on the map, but landing was only possible on grassy plains. The second airship, which was stolen from Garland, was far more advanced and paid reference to the previous interplanetary spaceships such as the Lunar Whale. This meant it had a more modern design that blended nautical elements with advanced Terran propulsion systems, and it also had improved gameplay function. This meant that in addition to being able to land on grassy plains, it could also land in deserts, swamps, and snowy areas. With the release of Final Fantasy IX, airships were cemented as a fundamental part of the Final Fantasy experience. And up to that point, they were almost always woven into the narrative and used as a method of exploration that liberated the player. But when work was underway on Final Fantasy X, many of these notions were challenged, and it saw the way airships were integrated into the core experience fundamentally changed. The party would gain access to an airship after the destruction of home, and access would be granted via Cid. Due to this association with the Al Bhed, the airship, which became known as the Fahrenheit, was based on ancient technology and featured an advanced propulsion system, aligning it well with previous futuristic airships like the Lunar Whale, the Ragnarok, and the Invincible. Players would also have the option to walk around the Fahrenheit, with Rim providing items, weapons, and armor for sale, and much more time and effort was placed on building out the airship's interior than in previous games, with numerous NPCs present and plenty of dialogue options available. The Fahrenheit also had involvement with combat, as in specific fights it would appear as a trigger command to control its distance from the target, as well as being used to deal damage in specific fights. Much of this was pretty standard in terms of what players would expect from an airship, but where Final Fantasy X differed was with its gameplay. Unlike every prior game, this would see the players have no direct control over the airship, as the autopilot concept that was developed with Final Fantasy VIII was evolved. This would see players select where they wanted the airship to go from a list of options, and once selected, the player would simply be transported there immediately. This mechanic could be used to uncover hidden locations, but it represented a huge shift in terms of the role airships would play moving forward. And in that regard, Final Fantasy X-2, which saw players take command of a new airship called the Celsius, adopted the exact same functionality and fulfilled many of the same traits. The only difference was that access to the airship was granted almost immediately, as opposed to the player having to wait. Due to it being massive in scope, when production was underway on Final Fantasy XI, the developers appreciated that the role of airships would need to change. After all, even though the world was gigantic, and allowing the players the opportunity to explore the skies would have been very tempting, it also had the potential to be quite chaotic. For this reason, even though the role of airships would be rather diminished, they did still retain the function of being a crucial mode of transport for traversing the world. And that was because airships connected every major city-state. Under this guise, players could use airships as ferries, a trait not associated with this mode of transport since Final Fantasy II, but players would only be able to gain access after obtaining rank 5 within a player's respective nation. To ensure everything operated according to the game's scale, airships ran on a strict schedule, and the journeys themselves were not short, with players able to walk around the airship and interact with other players. But due to numerous advancements in other areas of the game, even though airships are still running on a regular schedule, they aren't anywhere near as important for getting around Vana'diel as they used to be. Final Fantasy XII has often been called an offline version of Final Fantasy XI, and in some cases it's easy to see why, and if we're relating it to this specific topic, then the use of airships would be a primary example. Within this version of Ivalice, airships were plentiful, but within the earlier stages of the game, the primary interaction with airships would be via the Sky Ferry. Much like in Final Fantasy XI, this acted as a ferry service, with the players able to walk around the deck, purchase items from the store, find treasures in the updated versions, and even undertake fights. The other airship available to the player was the Strahl, a prototype that used an advanced propulsion system that was stolen from the Empire by Balthier. But, like in Final Fantasy X, it could not be flown by the player and was instead a fast travel mechanic. It could, however, be upgraded, a trait that had not been seen in terms of improving gameplay functionality since Final Fantasy VII. This was required, as without the Skystone, the Strahl could not access the Yagd. Some of this functionality was then carried over to Revenant Wings, where the Galbana served as the main airship accessible to the party. But outside of it allowing for fast travel to numerous locations, we also saw a significant evolution as the Galbana served as the base of operations. Not only did this mean players could walk around the airship, they could interact with NPCs in the Sky Saloon who owned various shops, as well as important characters like Penelo, Lud, and Qxi, each of which offered their own unique types of shops based around cooking and crafting. Players could also gain access to the notice board and logbook from the bridge, which would allow them to learn about new missions for them to undertake. Final Fantasy Tactics A2 would then feature a few traits seen within the previous Ivalice games, albeit in muted fashion. It would see an airship used to ferry players across the land, with several missions undertaken aboard airships. Final Fantasy XIII would become notable in numerous ways, as Square Enix attempted to reinvent the Final Fantasy brand, and in the context of airships, that sentiment remained very true. Much of the team who worked on Final Fantasy XIII had also worked on Final Fantasy X and X-2, two games that notably diminished the role of airships to a fast travel mechanic. And within Final Fantasy XIII, its role was diminished further, as there was no permanent access granted to an airship throughout the entire game. Instead, players would be ferried around by Minerva during specific moments. The next major game to feature airships did so in a manner befitting the place it now holds within the heart of the wider fandom. It would see Final Fantasy XIV feature countless airships as part of the narrative, with some, such as the Enterprise, connected with Cid. However, despite there being many airships featured across the main game and its many expansions, from a mechanical perspective, the implementation was reminiscent of what was seen within Final Fantasy XI. After acquiring the Airship Pass, this would see players initially able to travel between the 3 major cities. This was then expanded to other regions as the game built out, including Ishgard. The other airships of note are Free Company airships. They can be crafted and then deployed with the objective of obtaining various items. However, these are unmanned voyages, so very much an aside from the typical airship implementation. Final Fantasy Type 0 would continue the theme of having airships able to transport players via a ferry service. This could be initiated from the airship landing area in Academia, serving as a fast travel mechanic that connected the player with towns all around Orient that were within their nation's respective airspace. Later on, the player would gain access to their own airship called the Setzer. This could be controlled by the player, allowing them to fly around the map, something that had not been possible since Final Fantasy IX some 15 years prior. The Setzer also had heavy armaments, allowing the player to fire weapons and engage in dogfights, a significant evolution on previous airships that could aid the party within combat scenarios. In World of Final Fantasy, the player would gain access to the airship at the start of Chapter 21, and this would have a kind of hybrid functionality. With the area map open, players could gain access to the airship interior, and on the world map, they could also fly the airship around. But outside of finding Merc Rifts, there were very clear restrictions, and this meant the airship could not actually land at any locations. Instead, locations would need to be visited using a fast travel mechanic. And that brings us to Final Fantasy XV, a game that released shortly after World of Final Fantasy. There was a lot of speculation in the build-up as to whether Final Fantasy XV would feature an airship, and when the game launched, there was a real sense of intrigue as to how they would pull it off. And what we got was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. But even though that was the case, it still pulled from many familiar places. For instance, the airship came through upgrading the Regalia to create the Regalia Type F. This work was done by Cindy, Cid's granddaughter, and it allowed the player to explore Eos in all its glory through manual control. Much like earlier airships, there were also restrictions to where the Regalia Type F could land, as it could only land on roads. But in a first for airships, crashing or performing a bad landing would result in a game over. It represented a pretty extreme evolution in the grand scheme of things, but that it related to a car that was upgraded to fly served to show just how far the concept of airships had been taken over the years. What started as a cool mechanic for helping the player to explore ended up spawning a rather large trope. And although the heyday of player-controlled airships seems to be well in the past, it's good to see that as a narrative and world-building device, airships are still very much front and center. Whether that will continue to be the case within Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth remains to be seen, but even if the teams working on those games choose to opt for a more minimal implementation, there are still plenty in the back catalogue that have thrilled players through their speed and dynamism. And with that, we hope you have enjoyed this particular evolutionary study. If you did, please consider giving us a like, and as always, be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments below. I should also note that if you'd like to influence the types of evolutionary studies we produce in the future, make sure to check out our Patreon, as supporters get exclusive voting rights on upcoming evolution videos. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube members and supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Galcian Di Kujata, Gregory, and Lord of Morning, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.